So for this week on Cyber School, we're going to talk about a subject and a question rather that we get quite a bit in both our sales and our technical support department. And that's going to be how to successfully integrate CyberData products with poly paging, formerly Polycom paging. It's a little complicated. It's absolutely possible with every CyberData product, but it's a little complicated. So I kind of wanted to shed some light about it, what it is, and then how to integrate everything together. So first and foremost, what is poly paging? So it's a proprietary paging protocol used by Poly, formerly Polycom phones. It's pretty much a standard with all Poly or Polycom phones that you'll run across today, and it's built on standard multicast, where they took the standard multicast capability that you get from that was set by the RFC and kind of built upon it. And where it differs from standard multicast is it uses an odd port number instead of the traditional even port, which is just one thing that kind of makes it a little quirky. But the real quirky thing and the real different thing that they do is they use what they call a preamble at the start of the multicast stream. And it basically just alerts all of the phones on that particular network that's listening to that specific channel, because everything is broken up into channels instead of, say, multicast groups, that a page is coming through. And it's got this kind of little chirp that's very traditional that you'll know from anybody that's ever experienced poly paging or been around Polycom phones. They make this kind of chirp sound that's, I don't know if it's, something special that they have, trademarked or something like that, but it seems very unique. But it's something that they do that's just a little bit different as compared to standard multicast. So how's this going to be different from standard multicast now that we have, kind of a brief understanding with what poly paging is? Well, regular multicast is always going to use an even port to send and receive on. So any of your devices that are going to be creating or originating, sending out multicast across your network is going to be sending on that even port. And then of course, because the sending devices are sending on an even port, all of your receiving devices will of course be receiving on an even port, because that's just how it works. When you're dealing with multicast, the multicast is broadcast from some particular device to a specific address and port combination. And those ports that I was referencing are always going to be that even port number. So multicast groups are typically also differentiated with different address and port combinations, and they're typically unique, where you'll have, say, for example, 224.0.0.1 and port 5002 for one particular priority. Say, in your CyberData universe, that would be your emergency priority, and you would have a completely different IP address and port for priority 8, priority 7, so on and so forth. So that way you've basically got two differentiation points between those. Where Poly doesn't really do it that way. They use the same address and port combination for every single one of their channels, and channels in kind of their in air quotes, because that's how they differentiate themselves from basically everyone else in the telecom world, where everyone else basically uses that unique address and port combination. Polycom doesn't do it that way. They use they use a single address and port combination and then break it out into that proprietary channel. And that's where a lot of that preamble that I mentioned in our last slide there comes into play, because that gives a lot of the context to the actual phones on what channel that address and port multicast is coming through on. And that's where a lot of their proprietary special sauce comes in, is that kind of channel selection that differs from every other manufacturer out there, whether it would be, IP speakers like what you can get from CyberData to, other phone manufacturers such as Yealink, Grandstream, Cisco, what have you. Everything else is just going to be a little bit different. But some other differentiation points are, of course, just standard multicast doesn't have any preamble or any other kind of data that's sent with it. The stream literally just starts, and it's just a media stream at that. Whereas when multicast was created, it can be audio, it can technically be text, or it can also be video. Never really seen it done practically with video, but it can be. It's literally just a media stream, in quotes. Ben, that's one of the things that sets it apart. Of course, Polycom multicast or poly multicast has that preamble built into it. And the other kind of differentiation point that sets poly phones aside from other phones in the industry are going to be the limited paging channels that these different phones support. Poly phones only support 3 paging channels that the phone can actually be in. The defaults are channel 1, channel 24, and channel 25. And that would be kind of 1 is your default paging group, just kind of your general announcements. Hey, everybody did good for sales. We're having a pizza party in the lounge. Come get some free pizza. Where you've got your 24 group, channel 24, which would be your priority, which means that it will play over a do not disturb setting on your phone. So say you're in, focus hours at the end of your day, you hit that do not disturb because you don't want people calling you and bugging you. Announcements are still going to come through there. And then finally, they've got channel 25, which is the emergency channel, and that will play no matter what. If your phone's in use, literally you're talking to somebody, you're having a very, say confidential business meeting, you're talking about, finishing a sale that's, 6 figures, big opportunity, emergency notification comes through, that phone's still going to play it. It doesn't matter. That's kind of what it's designed for. It's emergency. So it's going to play through any time where the phone is in use or set to do not disturb. So that way that message can go out. And it's kind of by design with that emergency style announcement. So that way, if the phone is in use in the event of an emergency, you send it out at an emergency level and everybody's going to hear that. It's basically as long as that phone is plugged in and on the same local area network, it's going to be playing that particular emergency message. So why does all of this matter? Well, the industry standard is going to use a unique address and port combination for every multicast group, and that can make poly phones and other equipment, whether it's ours or say you've got some poly phones and you've got, say, some other manufacturers' phones, mixing those two can be kind of complicated because they're all going to do something a little bit differently. Where when you get some phones that are in the poly ecosystem and say you've got Yealink phones from, say, another building that you acquire and they leave all of their phone stuff there, you buy a business and they already have Yealink there and you move everybody into the big same office, you've got that problem where then poly phones can't page to Yealink and Yealink can't page to poly. But it gets complicated out there because all of the different equipment that you're going to try to incorporate into this big paging group must all support the poly proprietary paging methods. Again, because stuff like that preamble is going to be unique and proprietary to all poly manufactured devices. Meaning, even if, you try to go out and you reach out to your Yealink rep or, whatever company, what have you, and you try to get them to add poly support, they can't, or they might not be able to do that just because, that's a little proprietary special sauce in there. And that can make integrating non-poly equipment kind of challenging when you're trying to design a paging system, because if you've got one poly phone in there, you're going to want to have a lot more poly-based equipment. So how do we bring this into CyberData? Well, how does CyberData overcome these issues? Well, good thing to know is that any CyberData equipment is going to support poly paging, unless, it's extremely old. But, all of our stuff today that you purchase is going to support poly paging. So if you've got, a whole bunch of different poly phones in your environment and you want to add more additional paging, you can do that no problem. And you can have confidence in the CyberData brand because all of our products are going to support that poly paging. So again, we kind of need to talk about the receiving and sending devices. All of our CyberData devices are going to allow for channel selection to get into those different poly groups. And that comes into play with your receiving devices. So, of course, things like your CyberData SIP speaker or your CyberData VoIP SIP wall mount speaker, or your paging adapter, what have you, they're all going to have that different channel selection that you can select on our Multicast tab to basically pick what different poly groups that phone is, that particular device is going to be in. And of course, all of our stuff ships with the standard default poly channels. The default ones that poly uses, again, channel 1, channel 24, and channel 25. So by default, all you got to do is tune us into the standard multicast address and port combination that poly phones use, and you're basically good to go. But when it comes to poly or CyberData devices that can send multicast, you actually have to opt into a poly paging mode because, again, Polycom does things a little bit differently in terms of the actual page creation or origination. When the device actually creates it, it has to be sent on an odd multicast port. And that is actually against the RFC standard for multicast. So we've got a special mode where you can opt into poly paging, which basically allows you to break that RFC rule and transmit on the odd port, but also send that preamble that's going to be required by the poly phone, so that way they can actually receive that particular message. It's, those two kind of differentiation things. Just because your multicast is sent on an odd port number doesn't necessarily mean that the poly phones will play it. They need to have that preamble as well. Those two things go hand in hand. So how does all of this work? Well, again, we're kind of repeating ourselves here, but polyphones can be in three particular channels. And the default channels that they're going to be in is channel 1, channel 24, and channel 25. And this is all configurable. Again, those are just the defaults that the polyphones are going to ship in. You can, of course, adjust that. Some people do, but most customers that I've spoken with never change that. They just stick with the standard ones. And honestly, most of the time, they only use channel 1. They never use the emergency style ones, but they're there if you want to use it. And then, of course, when you're setting up the rest of your equipment, now that you've got everything figured out for your phones, you're trying to set up all of those fancy CyberData IP speakers that you've got, or maybe if you're keeping your analog paging system and you're going to use that CyberData paging adapter, you want to tune in the CyberData device to those specific Polycom channels that your phones are already using. So that way, anytime your phones are activated by a poly page, say somebody pages directly from a phone, your CyberData devices can also pick that up. But then when you're dealing with your devices that can send multicast, so of course things like your CyberData SIP paging server, the kind of primary device that's going to be sending multicast, you have to again opt into that poly paging mode by checking the box on our device tab to opt into poly paging, and then you've got to pick your specific channel that you're going to be paging it. Presently, CyberData devices can only page to a single Polycom channel. So that's one thing that you want to understand as you're going through and you're setting all of this up. So when you're paging in a poly environment, of course, you want to determine what channels are going to be used as you're going through and trying to design everything. You want to pick, are we just going to stick with our defaults, or are we going to change and be a little different? Again, most people just stick with the standard channels that everything picks. And then you want to pick your typical source of the multicast. And the nice thing with poly phones is by default, they all have one of your soft keys preset to send poly paging. You just press the paging key and then you press either 1, 2, or 3 on the actual phone's keypad to select what channel you want to page to, and then you make your page. And that you really have to differentiate and understand where do you want the actual source of that multicast to come from. Do you want it to come directly from your phones because all of the poly phones are going to support that? Or do you want to use some of that CyberData equipment that you have? Or perhaps you would primarily use the CyberData devices and use your, say, poly phones to page to specific groups. So that way you don't necessarily need to page to everyone by using something like the CyberData device. You get a lot of flexibility in there, but you'll want to determine what is the typical source for that multicast and what you're typically going to use when you're trying to make these different multicast pages. And if you're going to be paging from a CyberData device, you have to pick a specific channel. Presently, as I mentioned, CyberData devices that can actually output multicast are limited to a single poly channel presently. That may change in the future, but at the time of recording, it is presently only a single poly channel. So all in all, poly paging in a nutshell. It's going to be proprietary. They're the one manufacturer out there that still does things a little differently and hasn't really adhered to the industry norm. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's definitely a little bit easier to implement poly paging if you're only dealing with phones. But when you mix in more accessories and different other kind of equipment, it can get a little bit more challenging than, say, as compared to other phone manufacturers that just do standard multicast. And again, this is not a dig into poly at all. They make awesome phones. Sound quality is very, very good. And poly paging out of the box is super duper easy to set up. Probably, honestly, easier than many other phone manufacturers, including accessory manufacturers such as CyberData. You take out the Polycom phones from the box and you plug them in and they just work. The paging just works automatically. There is a benefit to that, but it's a little bit more complicated when you go and integrate other kinds of equipment with that different poly phones. But the nice thing is, if you want to go and choose different accessories for your paging system, such as door phones or underdesk panic buttons, it tie into your analog paging system or a brand new IP-based paging system, you can have confidence in CyberData because all of our equipment can be integrated into a poly paging system. So it gives you a lot of capability and confidence knowing that if I choose CyberData, all of my stuff is going to work with poly paging. And of course, paging from CyberData equipment to poly phones can be a little complicated, but it's easily accomplishable if you follow this video and you take the plans to step out what channels you're going to be paging to and what you're primarily going to be paging from.
Thank you for watching this edition of Cyber School. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.